My name is Nimrod Goren. I'm the head of Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policy. And I want to welcome you to our discussion about the Eastern Mediterranean, about new dynamics and opportunities for cooperation. This is a result of a joint project of the Mitvim Institute, which is a foreign policy think tank in Israel dealing with regional affairs, and the EuroMeSCo network. EuroMeSCo is an umbrella organization of more than 100 research centers on both shores of the Mediterranean. And EuroMeSCo operates under several working groups that are taking a certain theme of relevance to the Mediterranean region and goes in depth to explore that. And this year, Mitvim and EuroMeSCo look at the Eastern Mediterranean as a new sub-region that is emerging, that has some new opportunities, that faces some joint challenges, but definitely one that raises more and more attention within the international community. This discussion today is actually a product of the process that took place over the last year. It includes 3 research chapters that have been written. It included several meetings in different places where these chapters were debated as they were developed. We presented them initially at the annual conference of EuroMeSCo in Barcelona last year, and then the draft was discussed in a meeting that has regional participation that was carried out in Athens, ELIAMEP, with participation of different countries around the Mediterranean, for the offer to get the feedback and move forward in the writing process. And the final outcome has been published recently in EuroMeSCo. You can find the hard copy is out there on the table, and it's all going to be online, and you can review that as well. Today we'll present the chapters that have been written as part of this working panel, and each of the authors will present what they have written, and we have 2 experts that will respond to what has been said. Now we'll introduce each and every one in a few minutes. Each author will go for about 15 minutes, and then the respondents, and then we'll open up the floor for questions from your side. The event is on record, we are filming it, so everything we said is public. And we are very pleased to have the opportunity to look at the Eastern Mediterranean in terms of what does it mean for regional security? What does it mean to have natural gas refineries that have been discovered in the Mediterranean and produced new maybe incentives or dynamics of cooperation between different countries in the region? What does it mean to have a war in Syria, very close to this region, going on for such a long time? What are the consequences? So overall, if we look at this sub-region that we got going with this project with quite a bit of optimism, we see that the challenges within the sub-region are mounting. And if you look at conflicts that have not yet been resolved, we look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the stagnation over there, the escalation in Gaza, the peace process in Cyprus that we hope to move forward and resolve, tensions between Greece and Turkey, tensions between Turkey and Egypt. So quite a lot of challenges, but also the opportunities. And we see the natural gas deal that has been signed between countries in the region recently between Israel and Egypt. We see different geopolitical alliances taking shape, Israel and Cyprus and Greece, maybe Egypt, maybe Jordan. It's also a new phenomenon. For Israel's foreign policy, it's a new development. For Israel being able to be a significant actor in a new regional sphere in which it is capable of having a relationship with countries that are often in conflict with each other. So Israel has ties with Turkey and with Cyprus and with Greece and with Egypt and with Jordan. So there's a new win-win dynamic that Israel's foreign policy is not always accustomed to play. And it's a new sort of regional belonging for Israel. Some will combine European identity and Middle Eastern identity and somehow blend it all together. So I think those are the reasons why the attention to the Eastern Mediterranean has been on the rise over the last couple of years, both in the opportunities and the challenges, and that's what we're here to discuss for. So thank you all for coming here. And I will introduce our first speaker, Professor Panayotis Tsakonas, coming from Greece, with the Hellenic Foundation for European Foreign Policy, ELIAMEP. The chapter that he is going to present was written in cooperation together with Dr. Prof from EuroMeSCo. Professor Tsakonas is a professor of international relations, security and foreign policy analysis at the Department of Mediterranean Studies, University of the Aegean and Rhodes in Greece. He's been a NATO research fellow, a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University, a Fulbright visiting scholar at Yale University, and an academic visitor at Oxford University. He has worked as an advisor at the Hellenic Ministries of National Defense and Foreign Affairs, and served on the scientific executive boards of various state and private think tanks, and has lectured in numerous universities. We are very pleased to have you with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Muriel, for having me here again. As you have already mentioned, my presentation will be based mainly on a chapter which has already been written along with a colleague and friend and director of ELIAMEP. And to a certain extent, it attempted to answer, I would say, the most demanding aspect of the project, which had to do with some good ideas about how one can navigate the sub-region towards a win-win reality instead of zero-sum one, which is, as you might imagine, not an easy task. However, what we have done with Tsakonas so far was to come up with some ideas based on I would say what we know from a theoretical point of view with regard to particular areas and how these areas can be formed towards cooperative schemes, and security regimes theory seem to be quite productive towards this direction. So we came up with some ideas about how a particular limited security regime can be created in one of the most volatile areas of the world, namely the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean. And then Tsakonas has attempted to put some flesh on the bones, I would say, of that theoretical construction by investigating particular aspects of that security regime and how this can be built in the Eastern Mediterranean. So my presentation will be based on particular observations, I would say, that refer both to negative signs of limited regionalism, which is the case, as you all know, in the Eastern Mediterranean, along with some positive signs which are apparent in the area of at least the last 2 or 3 years. In other words, it seems that there is a kind of a long-lasting trend or trends of disintegration, confrontation, and potential armed conflict that goes hand in hand with certain positive trends of cooperation in the region. I'll start my brief presentation from that point by, first of all, highlighting the fact that that there is a limited amount of regionalism, by all means, which has been witnessed both during the Cold War period and the post-Cold War period, in terms of the lack of the formation of interstate associations or groupings in the area, along with, I would say, a Hobbesian security environment in the various adjoining areas of the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, one might refer to a long list of frequently interacting problems in the Eastern Mediterranean. I won't go any further on that. You're all aware of the various old and new threats which are present in the region. Particular reference should also be made to the fact that revolutionary developments in the area, such as the Arab revolts, have been added to the impact of other global trends or mega trends and drivers which have taken place globally. One might mention the shifting of global balance of power, demographic changes, technological developments, globalization, and climate change. So it does matter that these particular topical, if you like, developments have met with other systemic or mega trends that have taken place in the much broader security environment. At the same time, and with regard to those negative signs in the area, one might or one should refer to the weakening of state structures, which have already led or can lead to the collapse of current architectures, security architectures in the area, which can be exploited by various hybrid actors in the area, and to a certain extent change also the borders in the Middle East, along with the emergence of fragile, unstable, dysfunctional, and to a certain extent failed states, which have in turn also have important destabilizing consequences. Of course, there is one might add to that list of failed or dysfunctional, if you like, states, a number of states, starting from Yemen, Libya, Syria, by all means, and also particular reference should be made to the role of non-state actors, mostly of the militant Islamist variety, but also various hybrid, I would call them, organizations, which have been growing in the area. And that list of negative signs could be the loop. One might close the loop by making a particular reference to the diversity of threats and challenges, which to a certain extent are explained by the fact that cooperation in general is absent in the area, with regard both to regional groupings or initiatives taken by regional actors to form collective schemes, or with regard to the role of the European Union or other external actors which have already taken particular institutional initiatives, but with no luck so far. One might refer to the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, the so-called Barcelona process, NATO's Mediterranean Initiative, and by all means the most recent EU's southern dimension, EU's neighborhood policy. One might, on the other hand, one should refer to particular rather positive, I would say, diplomatic momentum which has been created in the area, and regards particular political and economic cooperative dynamics which are being flourishing in the area. One should, by all means, refer to the triangular strategic partnership or relationship developed by Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, with the involvement of Egypt to a certain extent because of its LNG facilities, and the most recent addition of Jordan, where the core of that relationship seemed to be cooperation in the energy sector, but at the same time it seems that there is a particular interest and a common link, I would say, regarding regional stability, which has to do with the collaboration after several official trilateral meetings that have taken place since 2016 on many more fields, besides the energy one, regarding tourism, research and technology, environment, water management, anti-terrorism, and migration. And one should also mention the multi-level and multi-dimensional sub-regional character of that cooperation scheme, plus the fact that it is not exclusive. It is not directed against any other particular state in the region. Those who have run the project so far has made repeated reference to the fact that any other state that they would gladly welcome other states with similar goals into that trilateral partnership. There should be, of course, a certain amount of reservation and skepticism with regard to the role of Turkey to that regional cooperation and how it can be developed. given the difficult, by all means, relations between Cyprus, Turkey, and on the one hand, and Cyprus, Egypt, Israel, and Greece on the other. And again, for closing the loop of positive developments, one should refer to the Greek initiative for the creation of a so-called Mediterranean OSCE in the region, with the participation of the regional states. There have been 2 rounds of meetings, one both in the island of Rhodes. The first Rhodes Conference for Security and Stability took place in September 2016, the second in May 2017, with the participation of many countries, but with the absence of Israel, which to my view is a key state of the region and a vital element, I think, of any essential structure of any future security arrangement in the Eastern Mediterranean, which to a certain extent had certain detrimental effects to the weakening of that particular initiative's external legitimacy. Now, I go straight to that theoretical scheme, I would call it, for thinking productively. That was the main research question to us. The question was what kind of regional cooperative initiatives could actually overcome the burden of the conflictual past and present in the region, ameliorate the security dilemma facing both local state actors in the Eastern Mediterranean, and make them, as well as external state actors, redefine the parameters of their strategic cost-benefit calculations on the basis of common interests, realistic expectations, and an option worth pursuing. Quite a question. Well, we came up with the idea of as I mentioned, the theory of security regimes offers some good starting point for thinking productively towards this direction. We ended up with the idea of proposing the creation or the establishment of a limited security regime in the area, with the aim of overcoming the aforementioned obstacles and create the necessary preconditions for that would allow the states involved to make that cost-benefit calculation and see that the benefits, if that regime is being established, would outweigh the costs they have to face if they keep following, I would say, power considerations, if their assessment is based on power considerations. So I won't bother you with any theoretical stuff on regimes and this kind of things. I should, however, refer to the prerequisites from a theoretical point of view that should be fulfilled in order for a security regime to be there, to come up and be functional and productive. A well-known American theorist, Robert Jervis, has written extensively on regimes, and he had come up with particular 4+1 reasons, as he mentioned, for a security regime to form. I should probably make a reference to the notion, or to provide you a definition of security regime. I don't know whether you're 3-4 minutes. 3-4 minutes. Really? Okay, I'll skip that. Then go straight to the proposal. Our proposal is that we cannot, as things stand now, either go to the things stand now in the Eastern Mediterranean, or in other words, the current situation in the Eastern Mediterranean is not ripe for the establishment of a comprehensive security regime, which all major security issues are covered, or for turning the region into a so-called security community. So our proposal is for doing the least we can, but pick up the right, I would say, thematic issues, focus on those particular issues that could really make the difference and can make progress if that regime is being established. And there are two issue areas which we think can act as a strong legitimizing factor for the establishment of that concert, if you like, of that arrangement, regional arrangement in the area. We call it limited security regime, around which the interests of the Eastern Mediterranean states could converge. And these are, number one, energy insecurity, or energy security, if you like, and there has been some talk and much more elaborated views on energy insecurity in a minute, so I'll not go any further on that. And the second one is jihadist terrorism. Focus on the second one and make a particular reference to the fact that with regard to the jihadist terrorism, there is a view shared by almost all states of the region, as well as by extra-regional powers, such as the Arab League and the EU counter-terrorism cooperation framework, that jihadist terrorism constitutes the most imminent of the threats emanated in the broader MENA region over the last decade. And it should be also noted that the majority of the Arab states are participating in the global coalition against ISIS, or Daesh. Of course, there are reservations or a certain amount of skepticism to that argumentation, but we still believe it's an issue we can focus on and see what is the particular role extra-regional powers can play towards the fulfillment of that goal, especially given the fact that the centrality and importance for global stability is shared by external powers, such as the United States, European Union, and NATO. So this might be a good reason for them to kind of a way out for them for abandoning policies of isolation and blaming states, this kind of diplomacy, and come up and follow and promote and support a more holistic, a more comprehensive approach of that type of regional initiative that would go beyond just counterterrorism policies or military measures. So, stop on that.
Thank you very much. You pointed our attention to the issue of identifying the Eastern Mediterranean as a sub-region on its own, the lack of a mechanism within the region, and the challenge of how do you make mechanism inclusive. Within all the conflicts that are happening in the region, how do you create mechanisms that are not seen by some countries as pointed against them, as excluding them? I think that's a challenge we may hear more about as we continue. The next speaker is Gabriel Mitchell, who is a policy fellow with us at Mitvim and a PhD candidate in governmental and international affairs at Virginia Tech University at the US. His research focuses on the relationship between energy security and the formation of Israeli foreign policy, international maritime law, and regional politics in the Eastern Mediterranean. Gabi is a fellow on energy security. He was a Mitvim representative in the US. He worked at the Jihadist Institute at the Shalem College. The paper that he is presenting to us was written together with Dr. Ehud Eran from University of Haifa and Mitvim. And Gabi is also working on issues related to Israel-Turkey Israel-Iran relations, US foreign policy, Israel diaspora relations, quite a big plate. So Gabi, thank you for being with us.
Thank you and good afternoon. I want to start by saying that one of the challenges that both Udi and I had when we started working on this paper is how to talk about things related to regional energy dynamics that haven't already been said. There's been a tremendous amount of literature in the last couple of years, some of it written by members of this audience, that I think effectively elaborates and touches upon the main question, which is or can offshore energy finds in the Eastern Mediterranean be some kind of facilitator for regional cooperation? Is it a game changer? And we very much wanted to weigh in on that, but we also wanted to just ask some very basic questions about how and in what way policymakers in the states of the Eastern Mediterranean should be looking at energy, how they're looking at it right now, and perhaps in new ways of looking at it. So most of the literature that's been written in, let's say, the last maybe 6 to 7 years has been trying to answer the game changer question and really pointing in a direction of, well, where is all of the energy in the Eastern Mediterranean going to go? We touch upon it. There are two really prominent options that have been discussed over the last couple of years. One is the East Med option, which has been floated as a undersea pipeline. It would be probably the longest in the world, that would run from Israel's territorial waters through Cyprus to Greece and inevitably to Italy. That is one suggested option. And the second suggested option is an Egyptian option, in which perhaps Israel and Cyprus pool their resources with Egypt, send their natural gas to Egypt's existing LNG facilities, where the natural gas will be converted into liquid natural gas, and then the natural gas could either be pooled with Egypt's own domestic supply or put on LNG ships and shipped anywhere in the world. Between the two options, we found there to be a truly interesting conversation that's really taking place, which is which actors are driving the conversation about energy. Is this a truly an Israeli conversation, and all of the other countries in the Eastern Mediterranean are just kind of secondary actors? And who are the external parties that are also shaping or trying to shape this discourse? And what are the other factors that aren't necessarily being discussed when we talk about pipelines and we talk about energy development? So I wanted to use that as kind of like a baseline for talking about 4.5 very specific things that have taken place that we've identified as byproducts of offshore development, not only in Israel's territorial waters, but those of Cyprus and Egypt and some of the other more secondary Eastern Mediterranean actors as well. We identified them as the following. First is the expansion and development of naval infrastructure on the part of Eastern Mediterranean states. The second is the demarcation of maritime borders or subsequent disputes by Eastern Mediterranean states over maritime space and maritime borders. The third is environmental and crisis management, and the fourth is the role of external actors in Eastern Mediterranean energy and security politics. So let's start with the first. The most obvious, perhaps the most visible byproduct, short of diplomacy and the presence of foreign diplomats or heads of state visiting other Eastern Mediterranean states, is the expansion of naval infrastructure, not only here physically in Israel, but amongst several Eastern Mediterranean states. Israel, both in 2012 and 2013, invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the expansion of its naval capacity. Similarly, Egypt has also expanded its naval capacity, Cyprus as well. Turkey, which does not necessarily have at present any kind of offshore reserves that it is developing, is also expanding its naval presence and its naval capacity. So one of the identifiers and the questions that we were asking was, is naval expansion a direct byproduct of offshore development, What are the other factors that are contributing to the expansion of these navies? And what does the expansion of a military naval presence in the Eastern Mediterranean say about the potential for regional cooperation versus confrontation? The first and the most obvious factor that we touched upon that was outside of energy development was the reduced presence of the United States and the U.S. Navy in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Eastern Mediterranean was traditionally the space of the U.S. Sixth Fleet. The U.S. Sixth Fleet has been significantly reduced over the last decade, and many of its ships have either been decommissioned entirely or relocated to other parts of the globe. Perhaps as a byproduct, or at least there's a correlation. At the same time as the U.S. military presence or naval presence has decreased in the Eastern Mediterranean, there's been an increase in both the Russian naval and Iranian naval presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. So while we want to draw a direct link between offshore development and the expansion of naval capacities in Israel and Egypt and Cyprus and Turkey, it would be unfair to ignore the other developments, security developments and the security dynamics that are taking place more broadly in the region, specifically for countries like Israel. Speaking, obviously we're located in Israel. I represent an Israeli institute. The dynamic and the relationship between Israel and Iran is not anything new to anyone in this audience. There's no question that is a factor, and certainly the contribution of the United States leaving and Russia inserting its own presence has created a vacuum to which perhaps Israel and many other states in the region feel the need to step up and replace what is missing. The question, of course, is whether all of these actors can manage to find a way to maintain some kind of cooperative relationship between their militaries and avoid any kind of escalation, not only between themselves. Most of the countries I just mentioned, Israel and Egypt, have a strong security partnership. Israel and Cyprus now have a strong and strengthened security partnership, in large part due to the prospects of energy cooperation, but also between these new and strengthened navies and non-state actors, including Hezbollah or Hamas, and as was earlier mentioned, other jihadist elements who may and have in the past threatened to target offshore energy infrastructure, and those threats are at least, and if you were to measure it by the rhetoric, both by military officials and political officials, threats that are taken very seriously. The extension of sovereignty into maritime space is a critical question when it comes to Eastern Mediterranean. It is not a question that most Eastern Mediterranean states have had to grapple with prior to the last 10 years, and it's something that needs to continue to be discussed, certainly as it extends into the second topic, which is the topic of maritime borders and the demarcation of maritime borders. Of the 15 states in the world that are not signees of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, 3 of them reside in the Eastern Mediterranean: Israel, Syria, and Turkey. Now, on the one hand, that doesn't necessarily mean that there will be confrontation between states over maritime space. And in most of the cases, the 3 cases that we decided to take a look at, Turkey's relationship with Cyprus, Israel's relationship with Lebanon, and Israel's relationship with the Palestinians, all 3 of the maritime disputes are essentially extensions of territorial disputes. In the case of Turkey and Cyprus, a divided island, and the dispute over maritime resources and the exploitation of offshore resources is really an extension of existing tensions between the 2 parties on the island. Similarly, Israel's dispute with Lebanon over the demarcation line of their maritime border, which has been in the news over the last couple of months, and on and on. There's been on and off mediation by the United States, is once again, according to some interpretations, an extension of territorial disputes that are several decades old about the demarcation line between Israel and Lebanon. And similarly, the dispute between Israel and the Palestinians over the exploitation or the exploitation of the Gaza marine field, which is located some 20-odd kilometers off of the Gaza Strip, is also an extension of existing disputes over the control of both naval and territorial borders that the Gaza Strip has. So in each of these three cases, these aren't unique disputes, and energy is simply a byproduct of existing territorial disputes. However, energy is proven to essentially just be an increased irritant, an additional point of conflict between all three parties. We don't necessarily make a suggestion that the non-signees of the Eastern Mediterranean need to get on board with the signing of UNCLOS. In fact, Israel has managed to reach exclusive economic zone agreements with parties, even though it is not a party of United Nations Accord. Yet at the same time, the absence of participation of Eastern Mediterranean states in these accords creates openings for potential conflict between these actors. Certainly one of the things that we were looking at and trying to find was areas in which Eastern Mediterranean states can cooperate and how energy can facilitate cooperation between these actors. And one of those is certainly the area of environmental and crisis management issues. It's been proven by multiple pieces of scientific research, in particular by the Maritime Center at the University of Haifa, that the Eastern Mediterranean is a particularly unique and fragile marine ecosystem. As a result, offshore development in that space has the potential, or at least there's a risk, of there being some kind of environmental impact. And of course, development has only been taking place for a number of years. Scientific research is relatively new. It's difficult to predict what kind of environmental impact there could be, but certainly in the case of disasters or worst case scenarios, this is something that not only the state actors who are encouraging offshore development should be considering and thinking about, but certainly the developers, the companies that are being brought in, whether it be Eni that is operating in Egyptian space, whether it be Noble and Delek operating in Israeli and also Cypriot space, and essentially we've proposed a couple of different options. First and foremost, even though all of the parties in the Eastern Mediterranean are signees of the European Union's Barcelona Declaration for Environmental and Maritime Protection, there aren't necessarily any clear foundation stones for any of these governments to be cooperating and working together. It's a little bit more ad hoc. At the same time, we recognize the fact that over the last, say, 20 years, there have been clear examples of emergency natural disasters in which Eastern Mediterranean states have essentially stepped up in order to help one another, whether it be earthquakes in Turkey or forest fires in Israel. We've found that these kinds of natural disasters have triggered large cooperative efforts by states that seemingly every other day of the year have an innumerable set of issues with one another, and yet in situations of crises step up. So similarly, perhaps the possibility or the prospect of natural or catastrophes or any kinds of crises, worst case situations when it comes to the development of offshore gas or oil could prompt some kind of good neighbor policy between Eastern Mediterranean states, and use that as a mechanism for greater cooperation. Cooperation not only on an interministerial level, but also integrated planning between states in order to create some kind of plan in a worst case scenario, in the inclusion of scientists from all of the Eastern Mediterranean actors, and of course incorporating the expertise and the know-how of the industry experts who are operating in those spaces. And many of those companies have tremendous experience and know-how when it comes to environmental risk management from experiences outside of the Eastern Mediterranean. The fourth and final, how am I doing with time? The fourth and final category that we decided to look at was essentially the role of outside actors and how outside actors are influencing the decision-making process that's taking place in the Eastern Mediterranean. We wanted to focus on three, the European Union, the United States, and Russia. The European Union obviously has a bit of a complicated role to play in the Eastern Mediterranean. Several Eastern Mediterranean states are members of the European Union, including Greece and Cyprus. As well, the European Union has existing protocols and relationships with Israel, with Egypt, with Lebanon, and has a on-off relationship with Turkey's membership status. So as a result, the European Union finds itself both in a position to facilitate conversation and dialogue between the parties, yet at the same time essentially is a member of those dialogues and conversations. At the same time, the European Union, at least, I mentioned the East Med pipeline, has always been spoken about as one of the most likely consumers of Eastern Mediterranean energy. And so there's a confluence of interests, both strategic and security interests, and perhaps economic and commercial interests that allow the European Union to play perhaps a more expanded role in the conversations that are taking place in the Eastern Mediterranean. The United States also has vested interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, and in particular over the course of the Obama administration, there were serious efforts made both domestically within Israel, but also more broadly on the island of Cyprus and with Turkey to essentially pave the way for some kind of pipeline from Israel via Turkey to perhaps a European market. Those efforts fell short for a wide variety of reasons, and it doesn't seem like those efforts are being reinvigorated in any way, shape, or form by the Trump administration, perhaps for a couple of reasons. One, they recognize that the Obama administration's efforts had reached the limit of their potential, and it's not an avenue worth pursuing, or perhaps because the Trump administration's general foreign policy is more for the external actors to reach the well on their own accord, and when they are ready, the administration will then invest. So it's quite possible that the option Israel-Turkey, even though we consider Turkey in our research to really be at this point on the outside looking in, perhaps there's a way for previously discarded options and forms of energy cooperation to be reinvigorated, provided that the parties themselves are interested in it, but it does not seem that this current administration is going to be doing the heavy lifting on the sake of all the other actors. And finally, if I was just to wrap up and finish with Russia, Russia's obviously increased strategic presence in the Eastern Mediterranean makes it an increasingly prominent player, certainly when it impacts the strategic and, in particular, naval considerations of all the Eastern Mediterranean states. But it shouldn't be ignored that Russia is the largest energy producer, at least in the immediate region. It's certainly the largest provider of energy to Turkey. It's the largest provider of energy to the European Union. And as a result, has a role to play, even if indirectly, in the future of energy exploration. Just to sum up, in 30 seconds, our conclusions were as follows: that energy and offshore development in the Eastern Mediterranean is not the game changer that everybody perhaps hoped at the beginning. However, with long-term planning on the part of the primary actors involved, there is the opportunity to create building blocks for cooperation, perhaps the foundation for some kind of regional cooperative initiative and integration. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabi, for linking the economic issue with the geopolitical ones, and how all of that also relates to environment and social issues. Next, we'll go into Syria and the implication of the war that is happening in Syria on the Eastern Mediterranean. And Dr. Muriel Asseburg from Germany will speak to us. Muriel is a senior fellow in the Middle East and African Research Division at the SWP, the German Institute for International Security Affairs. She also serves as the Institute as the product director for Elite Change and New Social Mobilization in the Arab world. Previously, Muriel was a guest researcher at the Carnegie Middle East office in Beirut, Lebanon, and was heading the Middle East and Africa Research Division at SWP. Her areas of expertise include the Middle East, Israel, the Palestinian territories, and the Arab Spring. Muriel.
Thanks a lot, Nimrod, for this introduction, and welcome also to everybody from my side. Yes, I'm going to be speaking about the war in Syria and Eastern Mediterranean dynamics, and I want to make three main points. The first is on the current state and trends that we see in the war in Syria. The second will be shedding a closer look what are actually the mutual repercussions between interests, activities, and effects of what Eastern Mediterranean states do in Syria and how the war reflects on them. So the interlinkages between those. And the third one would be on what to do or not to do. As the speakers before me have pointed out, the objective of writing this paper actually was to see if we can tease out commonalities and interests and approaches that would actually that could be made fruitful for regional cooperation, and in this particular case also for peace building and sustainable stabilization in Syria, and then understand how that could be supported, in particular by the EU, but also in general by external actors. Now, I'm somewhat a spoiler in this round of speakers, I fear, because what we see when we look at Syria and its neighbors, maybe it is a security complex that is developing, but it's anything but regime building in the sense of a sub-regional entity of some sort coming into place that has anything to do with order and agreed upon rules. Quite the contrary. So let me start with the first element of what I want to present here. And in this part, I want to make four main points, looking at different dimensions of the current state of the conflict in Syria. And I want to start out with the local dimension of the conflict. What we saw last year is that the conflict entered into a new phase, and it has left us with a very complicated picture. And often when we look at the media, I fear that the picture that is presented to us is somewhat simplistic. And the narrative usually goes that the original civil war between the regime and the rebels is over, the regime has won, and that's it. Not quite so. It is true that the regime has decided this confrontation in its favor, but not, of course, alone, but together with its backers. So today it controls some 60% of the territory, meaning it doesn't control 40% of the territory. The rebels have been squeezed into enclaves, and we see how these enclaves are being decimated by the day. Importantly, this military victory of sorts has had a side effect, and that is the strong dependency of the regime today on its state backers, mainly Russia and Iran, but also on militias, be they domestic militias, be they foreign militias. We also, and that is the second part of the narrative, see that the so-called Islamic State has lost almost all of its territorial base, but it still controls some 10% of the territory. So it hasn't been defeated. And more importantly, radical forces are still strong, and the Islamic State is slowly transforming into a guerrilla movement. So it remains a force to be reckoned with, even if it were completely decimated. Also, the PYD, that is the Syrian affiliated of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, controls some quarter of the territory today. It is the force that benefited most from the fight against the Islamic State over the last 2 years. None of the fronts thus have been pacified, and the regime is set to reclaim every inch of territory, as it likes to put it. So we are set for more confrontations on all the fronts, actually. And how far the regime will be successful in conquering the rest of these territories depends very much on the US on the one side. When we look at the Kurdish territories, it also depends a lot on Russia when it comes to other territories, and to a certain degree, of course, also on Turkey. The second complex is the regional dimension, and that, I think, is the one that is most relevant in this context. What we saw last year is that the perception among regional actors that the conflict is moving into some crucial stage has brought these players to intervene not only via proxy, as we had seen before, but much more directly in terms of military intervention. To pursue their own interests or to prevent other, be they local actors, be they regional actors, to assert their interests. And that has produced very strong confrontations and frictions, mainly in two theaters. One is between Turkey and the PYD, and we have seen repeated Turkish invasions to prevent a contiguous Kurdish zone of self-rule along the southern border of Turkey. Also in view of establishing a safe zone into which it could push back refugees. And again, here we are not, at this point of time, it's not clear as to how far Turkey will actually push forward and extend its, safe zone, or however you want to call it, towards the east. Again, that depending very much on the US presence. And we also don't know how a future border arrangement actually between Syria and Turkey would look like. The second arena where that plays out, and it has already been mentioned, is the one between Iran, Hezbollah, Syria on the one side and Israel on the other. And we see that both sides in this confrontation, which are of course not homogeneous sides, but do share several interests in each of the two blocs confronting each other, have been trying to enforce their red lines, that goes for Israel, or entrench their presence through civilian means, through military means, and through militias, that goes for Iran and its allies, ever more strongly. And that has, of course, over the last months led to direct confrontations between Iran and Israel for the first time, and a development that is very of great concern to me, because we do see a very severe risk of escalation, not only within Syria, but in the region, and to the point, when we look at these both of these arenas, to a confrontation that could involve the US and Russia also directly. Now, the factors to watch to see how these potential escalations might evolve is definitely the question of the US presence or US withdrawal of significant troops from Syria. It is the question of the expected Russian arms deliveries to the Syrian regime. And the third factor, definitely, I think, would be the question of the JCPOA, that is the deal between the international community and Iran falling apart, and the repercussions that that might have on the region. Third point I want to make in that context addresses the questions of efforts aimed at conflict resolution. What we have seen is that on the two main tracks where such efforts have been exerted, that is the UN-led process in Geneva and the Russian-led process in Astana, we haven't seen any success. And I would also hold that there is no prospect for such a success to happen. And why is that the case? I think there is two main decisive factors for that. One is that we lack a forum that could mediate or start out with addressing the interests of all the regional powers, a forum in which a sort of a code of conduct between these forces could be established with regards to Syria, and that could also serve as a crisis mechanism in terms of unwanted escalation. And the second one is that due to the military developments that we have witnessed over the last year or so, the regime has been ever more emboldened and largely been dissuaded from negotiating at all. So the fora that are there, be it in Astana, Sochi, on that track, or in Geneva, are actually no longer of relevance, because negotiations between the Syrian parties are not likely to take place as long as the regime feels so much emboldened by military victories. That means for the prospects for the conflict, and that is my fourth point, that it is very unlikely that we see a negotiated conflict resolution. It is very unlikely that we see a division of power or a political transition as was envisioned in Security Council Resolution 2254, and to which the international community, at least in words, still sticks to. Much more likely, we are going to see a continued fighting in the midterm, including, as I have said, the very severe risk of military escalation beyond Syria. This also means that we are unlikely to see any sustainable stabilization in the regime-held areas, not only in the areas where fighting will be going on. And that is the case because none of the inherited imbalances and deficiencies of the Assad regime will be addressed. We will see continued militia rule in these areas and the war economy also going on. And that also means that all efforts at local reconstruction that we will see in these areas will rather be a continuation of the civil war or the war with other means, rather than serve peace building and stabilization. And that means two more things. One is that we are very likely to see in these areas armed resistance or an insurgency forming against the regime. And we are we are very unlikely to see a large-scale return of refugees to such a Syria under Assad. Now, how is this all linked? And that brings me to the second part, to dynamics in the Eastern Mediterranean. I'm not going to go through the mapping that I've done in the text. You can read that if you're interested, of the activities and interests and how each of the neighboring states of Syria in the Eastern Mediterranean relates to the conflict in Syria. But let me just focus on the synopsis. What is very obvious is that from the beginning, among actors in this sub-region, there was completely contradictory stances on how to deal with the conflict in Syria. So from the beginning, there was no incentives to engage in any kind of cooperative approach to conflict resolution in Syria. Now, when we look at interests and activities today, we see that actually there are no shared interests, and if there are shared interests, they are not a priority. Let me give one example on that. At least when you follow the rhetorics, all neighboring states of Syria will say that they stick or they support a united Syria. But in practice, we see that all the states prefer to actually pursue their own interests, and that is much more a priority rather than pursuing a united Syria. There are some interests that are shared, for example, between the neighboring states except for Israel. All of them host a lot of Syrian refugees, so they have an interest in getting attention by the international community and attracting funding for that task that they have, but that creates competition rather than a cooperative approach among them. And then there is another area where we do have a convergence of interests among some actors, for example, between Jordan and Israel, who both have an interest that Iran's future role in Syria, and especially in the border area in the southwest of Syria, is contained or rolled back. But we also see that that hasn't triggered a more cooperative relationship between Jordan and Israel beyond that very narrow interests with regards to Syria. And here, and you have mentioned that, Nimrod, before, the Middle East conflict comes back in, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict comes back in, that has actually led to a situation since last summer with very tense relations between Jordan and Israel, linked to several incidents on that issue. The only other convergence of interest that we see is, I would say, between Israel and Arab Gulf states, and again, that is geared towards pushing back Iran's role in the region. And again, I fear that doesn't lead to constructive policies with regards to Syria or with regards to the wider region. So again, here, I'm not sure if that is an opening towards more security in the region, or to put it more bluntly, I fear it's quite the opposite, that it will lead rather to a more detrimental situation. So taking that all together, the dynamics that have been the consequence of the conflict in Syria, in the sub-region, are hardly paving the way for more constructive sub-regional dynamics, for closer sub-regional collaboration, or something that would be desperately needed, I would hold, that is a form of a sub-regional dialogue forum. And I also think they are quite detrimental to achieving sustained stabilization in Syria. If I still have time, I will go 2 minutes, very shortly through what I think are the three main priorities. And I've written in the paper about what Europeans should do, but what I'm going to say now also are priorities in much more general terms, so for the international community as such. The first one is trying to do everything to prevent further spillover of violent conflict and regional escalation, and that means first and foremost trying to establish a forum in which we have open lines among all regional actors involved. And if that is not possible, then at least have open lines of communications by whoever can provide these direct lines, so have them on a bilateral level. The second is the protection of refugees and a much stronger focus on refugee communities in neighboring states and in Europe. And I'm saying that in particular because I think, as I pointed out, that most of these refugees will remain refugees for a long time. So an investment in empowering them, becoming part of societies where they are based would be a good investment, rather than laying the basis for more destitution and radicalism in the region. And the third one would be that I think external actors should refrain from all measures that remove pressure from the Assad regime to adopt a more inclusive and a more inclusive approach, and force it to engage in structural reform. Now, will the international community be successful in that? I don't know. But the earlier everybody gives in and says we're going to have to deal with this kind of regime anyhow, the less influence it can have on the regime.
Thank you, Muriel. It was evident from your talk how difficult it is to identify these shared interests within the sub-region, but also to the point that when these joint interests actually exist, how difficult it is to implement a collaborative approach towards them, whether it's because of competition over resources or other conflicts that get in the way. In our thinking, that's the place where civil society can become more influential, where the official governments are finding it difficult to cooperate, those countries can find other channels of less official modalities. There is actually a paper accompanying this project which is looking at the role that civil society can help in overcoming conflicts, in promoting democracy, human rights in the region, and I think it relates to some of these points. We are moving on, after presenting the 3 chapters, to some views on the chapters, and the first one will be done by Valeria Talbot from Italy, who was actually the reviewer of the papers as they were written, so she knows them from the earlier versions to the final output.
Thank you, Nimrod, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here with you, and I was very happy to review the policy study. I really appreciate the papers and the presentation and the effort to go beyond difficulties and tension in the region to find a common ground for cooperation. And I will focus, just a few remarks and some questions. I will focus mainly on the security issue, and because there is a crucial issue, the need for a security framework in the Eastern Mediterranean, as was highlighted in the first chapter of the study. Of course, we are all aware of the difficulties to create a security framework, and we know that today there aren't the conditions, there is not conceivable, but the idea of a limited security regime is very interesting, and of course, there are opportunities and there are limits, as the author have stressed in the paper, because often partnerships are developing more on the perception of common threats rather than common interest. But in the energy security or insecurity area, we are seeing some positive developments, some enhanced cooperation. Let me use the language of the European community, of the European Union, when we talk about cooperation among some states, but open, inclusive to other states. And so we have seen interesting development in cooperation between Israel, Cyprus, Greece, and Egypt, which is very, very important. But on the other side, there are the limits. We thought, as it has been stressed, that energy, gas cooperation could be a game changer. It was not completely the case, and it's also a source of instability. We saw latest developments and tensions between Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus at the end of January, beginning of February. In Italy, the case was followed because an Italian navy was involved in the case. So a source of instability, also a source of competition. As for the other area of cooperation that was identified, jihadist terrorism, of course, in this case, there is a common perception of the threat, and there is a shared interest in defeating terrorism, in counter-terrorism. However, local, regional, and international actors in the area not always have played consistently. In some cases, they, following their own interest, they have undermined cooperation and created conditions that have favored rather than defeat the Islamist threats. So it's important, you have highlighted the role of the state actor in playing a role in engaging for a security, a limited security regime. But I wonder what role for non-state actors who are very important today. How to engage non-state actors in a security engagement in a security arrangement. The other big question is what role for the international players, and we come to the Syria. Syria is the best example. Outside players not always are a source of stability, they are often a source of instability. And Muriel stressed very well the complexity of the crisis in Syria, of the conflict in Syria, where there are different and conflicting interests, different and conflicting agendas among the players involved, among local actors, regional actors, international actors. So with different objectives. So the risk of escalation are very high. We saw in the latest development in a couple of weeks ago. And a solution of the conflict is not, it's very, very unlikely in the medium term. Reconstruction is not on the horizon at the moment. So the question here is who has a strategy for Syria? Who has a strategy to establish a long-term settlement in Syria? The international players have the leverage on their local allies, a real leverage, and there is a real willing to solve the conflict and to think of a long-term arrangement. So today nobody believes in a regime change in Syria, so how to deal, the other question is how to deal with Assad, with the Syrian regime, bearing in mind that it is a source of risk in the future of Syria, and it is also a magnet for radicalization. Muriel said very well that ISIS has been defeated, but ISIS is still in Syria. ISIS is a source of instability, of threat for Syria, and not only for Syria, for the region and beyond. So there are many risks and there are many challenges in the picture of the Eastern Mediterranean, and I would say of the broader Middle East. And what role for the international players and for local players as well. I have a last question on the energy, and as Gabi pointed out, energy is energy security or insecurity is a byproduct of territorial disputes, and it is the case of Turkey and Cyprus. But don't you think that there is also a real Turkey's interest in diversifying its energy supplies, in securing new energy supply and reducing its dependence on Russia. So of course there is the territorial dispute, the issue of Cyprus, which is very important not only in relations between Turkey and Cyprus, but only between Turkey and EU. But there are, I think, energy security interests to be taken into account. I stop here and I leave the floor to the other speaker.
Thank you, Nimrod, and thank you for inviting me. Maybe I'll just start with presenting what we do in the Foreign Ministry in the sense of economy. I belong to the economic division in the Foreign Ministry, and we put the economy in the service of diplomacy and the diplomacy in the service of economy. So it's two sides of the same coin. We try to find ways how the economy can bring stability and strategic benefits, and of course, in the issue of the energy, it's quite basic and connected to the reality. So I'll try to connect the reality to the things that were mentioned here, to the models that were mentioned. Not all of them, but I will mention the foreign, the larger picture, the foreign actors like the EU, US, Russia, and the local ones, which are, of course, Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, etc. And other things that were mentioned. So I'll try to, as I said, bring you the actual picture, what's going on today. So let's start with the East Med, which was mentioned here. And before that, I would like to mention that with the EU now we have much larger discussion in a broader group of countries, which is not only Greece, Cyprus, Israel, and Italy, but also Spain and Egypt. And in this forum, which is going parallel to the forum which discussed the East Med, in this forum we look for cooperation in the Eastern Mediterranean on energy. If it's infrastructure, if it's infrastructure of pipelines, for example, cooperation in infrastructure, environment, and other issues. So some meetings were held already, and I think it's a good thing. The Europeans speak about the East Med gas, natural gas. They talk about the needs to diversify their resources, of course, vis-a-vis Russia mainly, and they want our gas. So the gas can come from Israel, but also from Cyprus and Egypt. That is why everyone is talking about the East Med pipeline. Today we speak about 16 BCM going to Europe, and the source is not clear yet, but most probably it will be Leviathan, because there is nothing else that we see today. Zoe will supply for the local market in Egypt. It will not come into the game of East Med, probably. Aphrodite is going to be developed and sent to liquefaction in Egypt. So the only major reservoir that we talk about is Leviathan. It's not mentioned officially anywhere, but probably this is what everyone talk about. By the way, the companies, the partners of Leviathan, they're not connected to the East Med yet. So probably will be in the future. It's good to talk about the East Med because it's good for Israel, due to the fact that we look for further development of our sea, which means we need evacuation of gas, and this is one way to do it. And so we can bring more companies to the region. It's good for Greece because Greece wants to be a hub, and it's good for Cyprus because they want politically to be part of it, and I think everyone knows what I mean. And for Italy, because Italy wants to consume the gas. The main consumer of this gas will be Italy, because Greece will be needing 1 or 2 BCM, and the rest are few, but Italy is the major consumer. And of course, Italy is going to build it, probably, it's Italian company, I mean, not the government. So it's a part, and now they even talk about a partnership. The word partnership on energy between Europe and Israel was mentioned and is being mentioned more and more. So it's good for Israel strategically to be a partner of Europe in the sense of energy. The US, well, US was mentioned here. The US and Russia are fighting over hegemony on the European energy security, and they are promoting and facilitating things that are important for us. If it's Turkey in the past, now Turkey is no longer on the table in the sense of exporting to Turkey, but with other actors in the region. And then Russia. Russia is putting what I say usually in the US context, but boots on the ground, Block 9 and 4. They are part now 20% by Novatek, and Zohr is 30% by Rosneft. So they are here, and they are looking also for involvement in our own gas in Israel. Then Turkey, as I said, the pipeline to Turkey, the export to Turkey is no longer on the table now. We had, I think, it's very interesting because the whole arrangement with Turkey was built on the energy 2 years ago. Things are not going well, and I think it is because the gas is no longer on the table. Now, why the gas is no longer on the table? Because of price. It's very simple. The price was too high for the Turks, so they're no longer interested. And I even didn't mention Cyprus, which is a major issue here. But we didn't get there. We spoke to the Turks for a few months, and we didn't even get to Cyprus. Export to Jordan and Egypt are part of the stability that we're building through pipelines. So pipelines can be problematic as EastMed because of Turkish. The Turks are against the EastMed, so I didn't mention it, but it's obvious. Maybe we'll have to change the route because of Turkey. I mean, maybe we have to change everything to recalculate our route because of Turkey's involvement in the region now. They prevent drilling by Cyprus, and they might prevent the feasibility study done by the EU and Italy and other partners, the feasibility study of the EastMed. They might hamper the boat, the ships, and we have to look for new ways to overcome it. So stability is built, I think, by exporting to Jordan. Half of their electricity will be consumed by our gas. It was difficult for the public to accept it, but they have no choice. Egypt, same. We will going to export to Egypt for local market. And maybe the Palestinian Authority, which brings me to Gaza Marine, which we might see the development of Gaza Marine after it was taken back to the Palestinian Authority, given back by BG and Shell. We might see new developments there. Then other countries in Europe are interested also in Israeli energy. Bilaterally, we hear from Norway, from Denmark, from Germany, Spain, Italy, other consumer, possibly Bulgaria, Romania, Balkan countries, they are interested in our gas. EastMed can be connected somehow, so it's very good for our international relations. And finally, a word about the trilateral. Greece, Israel, Cyprus. The next summit will be on May 8th in Nicosia. And so we will see, we are building a joint agenda, a trilateral agenda, which is a new thing in our diplomacy. It's very interesting. We are used to bilateral diplomacy, of course, it's very easy. And we are used to multilateral diplomacy, but trilateral diplomacy is something new. It is a challenge because you need to find the things that are interesting to all three, and not bilaterally, just all three. Like, I always give the example of marine archaeology, for example. It's an issue which is very interesting to all three, Cyprus, Greece, Israel. But of course, more important is the energy. And the tourism and other things, but energy is number one there in a trilateral, and in fact it is the most important component. I'll stop here.
Thank you all. There have been some questions by the respondents to the speakers that they will have time to address, but I also want to open the floor now for questions from the audience. So whoever from you wants to ask a question, please raise your hand. We'll collect a few. Please identify yourselves and keep your questions as short as possible. And if you want to address them to a specific speaker, let us know. There's a mic in the back that can go around. So if someone has a question to any of the speakers, this is your time.
My name is Eric, and I'm from the EU delegation. And Mr. Gabriel Michel, as I understood you, you said that you think the European Union actually has the means to do more in the Eastern Mediterranean region than it currently is doing. And I was wondering if you can elaborate on how you think that the European Union could play a more important role. Thank you.
My name is Emmanuel Shachaf. I'm from the Federation Movement, and the question is addressed to Gabe Mitchell and Ambassador Adam. There, as far as I understand, there's some kind of dispute between Israel and Lebanon with regard to the exploitation of energy resources. Could you please speak a little about that? Is it a big dispute? Is it small? Can it be used in the framework of diplomacy to develop things? Thank you.
Since indeed one of the problems of selling Israeli gas to Turkey was the price, it's only one of the problems, and it's really an iteration because the issue was that the politics are so bad, which means that the pricing was not compelling enough to make a go of it. But since the price in Turkey is higher by about 15% than it is in Europe, and since the pipeline to Europe is going to be 4 times longer than a pipeline to Turkey, so then how can gas to Europe be justifiable if it is not to Turkey?
I would like to first question to the lady, to Asseburg, if I get you correctly regarding the strategy of the refugees of the European Union, the paper that is going on. You mentioned that actually European Union should be in direction of holding the refugee on the territory where they are, if I take you correctly. It means that, I suppose you're coming from Germany. You want to hold all of this because, within the European Union it was a strong division regarding, let's say, equal distribution of the refugee within the European Union. As you know, we as a country, especially Greece, it was pretty much, tense regarding the refugees as well. Through Macedonia, they passed before 2 years almost 1 million people by foot. It was not a good picture. Seeing all the people with the children and everything. How they're passing the country. It was disastering. I was traveling a lot and it was really, really amazing. What it means that we heard, the statement from, if I remember correctly, before 2 years, German chancellor was speaking about we will need actually to deal with the refugees and as well the international community inside the country. What I was hearing, it was that it will be years and years, till the refugee process will stop, That means that there will be, in a near future, not any light in the tunnel, actually, if you are foreseen like that. That was I was asking, and because as well we are a little bit, affected of that, and because all the countries are a little bit, besides all the problems they have, regarding that.
Thank you.
I wonder that, and the second question to distinguished Ambassador Adam, we would like to know, if I may ask, on which stage this is only the negotiations on trilateral, so there are already certain things agreed, there is a project, or how much time we'll need about the East Matthew to be much more. As well, thank you very much that there is an interest as well for the other countries, to be energy sufficient, how to say, because the gas is nowadays pretty much. We would like as well, how to say, because we are interconnected with Greece, by energy, and, for a future. Because we were actually on the crossroad, but we were missed from all those projects they were talking about, in the region. Somehow Macedonia, it was rather, out of that story, from different sides.
Now we are under the discussion for the IGA, the Intergovernmental Agreement, which might end until the end of this year, 2018, which gives the commitment of the governments to the project. And some other issues that we will talk about, cooperation, in security cooperation, which was mentioned here, environmental, etc. 2019 is going to be the year of the feasibility study, which is financed by the EU and the company which has the project, IGI Poseidon. It's a Greek-Italian company. They are doing the feasibility study. If it's done according to the timetable, if no problems occur, then they will finish it by the end of 19, when the final investment decision of the project, according to the feasibility study, because we have, as Gina correctly said, how come we can sell gas in South Italy? It's normal prices. So this is exactly why we have feasibility study, financial, economical viability, and the technical one to the project. Italy wants to know very well how much they will pay, and it's very correct. And then if everything goes fine and there is an investment decision, you have to bring the money, someone has to build it, and in 2020, the plan is that in 2020, we start the project, beginning of mid 2020, and by the end of 2025 or the middle of 2025, this is the timetable, we will see gas flowing into Greece and Italy. Do you want me to relate to another thing, or it's, for the meantime it's enough? Yeah.
Okay, I'll quickly address three questions. The one on refugees. I'm not sure we understood each other well. What I'm saying is the following. First, we need to see that the main burden of the Syrian refugees is with the neighboring countries. It's not in Europe.
Okay.
Second,
Sorry.
Syrians themselves would like to go back today rather than tomorrow if they have a future in Syria. Now, the way the situation in Syria is developing means that the bulk of the Syrian refugees will not have a future in Syria. And we can see measures taken by the regime every day that will prevent people from going back. So that means that we should have a realistic attitude towards the refugees that are in host countries, among them in Europe. And a realistic attitude would be, let us invest and not only talk, let us invest in these people so that we don't have a lost generation, we don't have people growing up in miserable situations. And the situation in Lebanon is very miserable for refugees. Let's not create further strife between host communities and the refugees, but let's try to empower these people. That was what I wanted to say on the refugees. The two questions that you put to me, Valeria. Who has a strategy for actually solving the conflict in Syria and stabilizing Syria in the long term? Nobody. But there are countries that have strategies to furthering their own interests in Syria. And I think Russia and Iran are among the countries who are doing that most consistently and very purposefully. So there is no lack of thinking of how they approach this issue. Now, are they successful in everything they do? Of course not, because there are reactions to that. And that addresses the second question you put in that context, because also their leverage over local forces is limited. But it's much less limited than the limitations that others have over what they call their allies on the ground. So the West, I think, has lost basically all the leverages it used to have over the rebels, the Arab rebels and the Kurds by now. They have lost the Kurds as a partner in the fight against the Islamic State. And that is also, of course, the result of not taking positions and not following through on strategies that you would have adopted. The other questions that you put on how to deal with the Assad regime. I think it's clear, and there is confusion among Westerners at least, that of course those who represent the regime today will be part of the future system. So to demand that they step down, that we shouldn't negotiate with them, also doesn't make any sense. They will be part of the future of Syria. The question is, do we have leverage at all to have an influence on what is being built in Syria? And I think we have reduced that leverage, and it's being, if the US now withdraws their forces, it will be further reduced. But there are some issues where we can have leverage. One is, of course, the question of reconstruction. I'm not speaking about local projects, but large-scale reconstruction, that is via the financial institutions. Two is the lifting of sanctions. That is important, an important impediment for the regime now. The three is recognition. That means resending of ambassadors, dispatching ambassadors of those countries who have withdrawn their ambassadors. And the fourth, I forgot. But there are a number of things where we can have potential leverage if we play it smartly, but not if we are divided on these issues.
And the EU is becoming divided on many issues.
Okay, so there were a number of questions that were energy related. I'm going to try to address them, each one very quickly. In regards to the EU role in the Eastern Mediterranean, I want to sharpen what I had said earlier. I think that the European Union has no choice but to be involved in Eastern Mediterranean affairs, being that it's its backdoor, and the existing relationship with a number of Eastern Mediterranean states, and there being two EU members, full EU members in the Eastern Mediterranean. At the same time, its options are therefore limited. The set of options that exist for future activity between the European Union and Eastern Mediterranean states has in some ways already been baked in. Of course, the thing that was mentioned earlier, and I think that this is really important as it relates to energy, is that because European Union states are interested in purchasing and being the final destination for Eastern Mediterranean gas, that provides a window of opportunity for the European Union to engage perhaps in issue linkaging between, when it comes to territorial disputes or maritime demarcation or even environmental issues as something built off of energy cooperation. That might be a good segue to just talk about feasibility in general. From my perspective, there are essentially three layers of feasibility that need to be tested in order to develop large-scale energy projects. there needs to be political cooperation, there needs to be economic feasibility, and there needs to be technical feasibility. And of course, when you talk about economic feasibility, it's not just about the producer, the transit states, and the consumer. It's also about the state of global energy prices. Given the current state of global energy prices, I'm skeptical about the feasibility of the East Med pipeline, because there are other alternative, cheaper sources, including sources from the United States, that might be more realistic in the short term. That doesn't mean that the parties aren't interested, and it doesn't mean that it won't be realized. I just tend to be a little bit more on the skeptical side. And obviously, there are also existing technical feasibility questions about a pipeline of that length, and the undersea landscape, particularly between Cyprus, Crete, and Greece, and the costs that it would cost, that it would be for all of the involved parties. When it comes to Turkey and diversification of supply, obviously Turkey is a country that's completely energy dependent. Not only is Russia one of its primary providers, but Iran is its second largest supplier of oil and natural gas. Turkey, let's say 5 or 6 years ago, had a dream of being the energy hub and transit point, and it still is a transit point for, to my knowledge, at least 6 existing pipelines, and Turkey plays a role in transferring oil from northern Iraq to a lot of different countries, including here in Israel. But that being said, you know, the points that were mentioned by Ambassador Adam about the feasibility of the pipeline, you know, both in terms of price, although that's the first time that I've heard that, but also the political issues that existed between Turkey and Cyprus, I think have limited it. We all saw the summit between Presidents Erdogan, Putin, and Rouhani. So I think that even if Turkey does have a vision of diversification of supply, it knows who its suppliers are, and its suppliers know what Turkey is buying. Last but not least, I don't think that the maritime dispute between Israel and Lebanon should be blown wildly out of proportions. And in fact, I would first say it should be seen through the lens of internal Lebanese politics and the role that Hezbollah uses, the way that Hezbollah uses tensions or uses Israel as a means to manage its own domestic game within the Lebanese political scene. That being said, the strategic threats posed by Hezbollah towards Israel or towards offshore platforms and infrastructure is one that the Israeli security establishment takes seriously, and these things were serious enough for the United States to play a mediating role, even if it didn't necessarily result in anything. But certainly the United States, and I would say also the European Union, have a vested interest in, at the very least, managing that situation, even if it's unlikely to necessarily boil over into something beyond kind of saber rattling.
Thank you. I'll respond to Valeria's question mainly. There has been no question from the audience. It seems that the issue of theoretical prerequisites for the establishment of security regime is not the sexiest thing one can think of, apparently. But if I may, I would like to touch upon the very briefly on the issue that has been raised with regard to the role of the European Union in, especially with regard to gas pipelines and energy security. It seems that the European Union is still not as efficient as it could be with regard to projecting its normative power. However, at the same time, there has already been decision made within the European Union with regard to the strengthening of its defense capabilities through a series of initiatives, such as the permanent structured cooperation. And so there is some thinking within the European Union on how PESCO can, and CSDP in particular, can touch upon those issues and also have a kind of a contribution towards dealing with issues of energy security, which is by all means an important issue for the European Union. At the same time, one should also have in mind that the European Union still experiences the so-called expectations capabilities gap, which seems to be the case for quite a long time. So now, Valeria, I think, has made a very important point with regard to having non-state actors on board. How we can engage non-state actors in that regional security arrangement we can think of. What is interesting is the fact that I did not have the time to make particular reference to the prerequisite for the establishment of a regime, and particularly for the prerequisites that should be there in case a security regime is successful, or would like to see it being successful. And one of those prerequisites is the fact that this regime, or any regime of that type, should be inclusive, should not be exclusive. So by definition, the role of non-state actors is there. We have to think of how we can have non-state actors on board and how we can engage them. How we can really engage them, I don't know. What I know, however, is first of all we should, and then and also we have to overcome particular obstacles which are already there as prerequisites of the regime. One of them is the fact that for a regime to be successful, we have to think in terms of a balanced distributions of gains, or an exchange of a balanced exchange of agreements between the actors in being involved. So we have a problem with non-state actors because they do not really know how to negotiate. Number one. Number two, second obstacle, it seems that non-state actors are more prone, if you like, compared to states, to defection. So we have an additional problem. It seems that it is really hard to make non-state actors function along the agreed modes of contacts, along agreed rules, which are already there in case a regime is being formed. So, two particular obstacles, responding to your very good point on, first of all, in having non-state actors being involved. We should, by all means. Number two, you have to, in addition to that, to overcome particular obstacles which seem to be there, particularly when one has to have non-state actors on board.
Do you have any comment? So I think you gave an answer to most of the questions. Just a few observations from our work in this medium. First, regarding relation with Turkey, it was interesting when Mitvim held its dialogue in Istanbul, just as the Israel-Turkey agreement was signed, a difference in the language between the Israeli side and the Turkish side, whereas the Israeli side was emphasizing the natural gas issue as a basis for the two countries to restoring relations. The Turkish discourse was a very different one and was focused on strategic issues. So at least in Istanbul, what we heard was toning down the aspect of natural gas as a cause for reconciliation, but it also put an emphasis on Israeli interest in becoming involved in helping other conflicts in the region to be resolved. So all of a sudden, Israel at the time had an interest to maybe find a way to assist conflict resolution in Cyprus, and maybe when we look at Egypt and Turkey, and does Israel have an interest there to help the two countries become with better relations? So it opens up different diplomatic roles within this trilateral diplomacy that you mentioned, that also looks at other types of triangles where Israel can have a role. In Israel, at least, the Russian involvement in the East Med is, I think, is not looked to the level that it happens. People are looking at Russia as an actor in Syria, but what you mentioned about the Russian involvement in the gas and energy sector, and its political involvement in different countries of the Eastern Mediterranean, especially with the challenges that the EU is facing in trying to formulate a cohesive policy towards the East Med, is something that I think deserves more attention. And regarding the U.S. role, it was interesting to see the U.S. mediation of the Lebanese issue, Emmanuel, that you mentioned, that after a year in which the U.S. kind of pulled its hands back from the mediation over there, all of a sudden you saw some activism and mediation efforts that didn't move anywhere, at least significantly as far as I know, but was again resumed. Looking at regional conflicts also from the perspective of a Eastern Mediterranean lens rather than a Middle Eastern lens is also maybe have some potential when we look at the issue of Gaza, and we see Gaza as an East Med issue, not only as a Middle Eastern issue, and you referred to Gaza Marine, but there were also talks in the past about some seaport in Cyprus that will serve Gaza, and other ideas on the East Med conflict conference context is an interesting one, plus the opening for different type of Israeli-Arab dialogue that is happening in the Mediterranean context. And that's not only East Med, but rather the broader Mediterranean, including the countries in North Africa. And it's not by chance that we see Moroccan involvement in looking into Israel relation within the Mediterranean, how kind of the neighborhood to Europe is being defined by countries on the verge of the EU. So it opens up new opportunities for Israel on other topics than the ones we discussed. I thank all of you for the conversation we had in your presentation. I thank the staff of Mitvim and also of EuroMeSCo. EuroMeSCo is not here, but they played a very crucial role in the process, very supportive of what we've been doing throughout the year. And we'll be introducing these chapters once again this summer in the conference of EuroMeSCo, which will be taking place in Morocco this time around. And as you depart, there are still drinks and coffees and snacks outside that you can take before going out to the rain. So thank you everybody for being here with us, and you're welcome to follow us.